Good morning, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Indica Books Writers Workshop with Otis. The way it works and the way it has been working since 2020 is that we encourage and invite you to send writing pieces, short writing pieces, 800 to 1,000 words, and where you're looking for some suggestions, feedback, or just have a trained professional eye look at your writing piece and give feedback. So we invite you to send those pieces, and Otis reviews and marks your pieces up, sends them back to you. And when we convene on Sunday, typically at 8 p.m., we go over, discuss, review those pieces. And the intent is to have a freewheeling discussion where everyone can benefit from the feedback and ask questions, and in general, try and become a good, better, more informed writer. So with that, I will turn this over to you, Otis.
Okay, thank you. Welcome back, everybody, after our break, and thanks for sending work. Let's see. Let's jump right in. We have 3 pieces, and Madhavi, let's look at your piece first.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? Hey, how are you?
I'm fine. I've been missing the classes.
Let's see. Let's want to share your piece. Okay, great. I want to have all these things. Okay, Madhavi, why don't you tell us a little bit about this piece? What are you going for, and what's the work looking like in a larger sense?
So this piece is part of an anthology, an upcoming anthology, concentrating on Kashmir. So in this story, I'm concentrating on the 8th and 9th century Kashmir and Adi Shankaracharya's visit and his subsequent accession to the throne of Omniscience. There's a temple called Sharda Temple in Kashmir, which was considered as a seat of knowledge. So, and this ultimate seat of knowledge was embedded in many folklores, and in fact, Shankaracharya's visit also has many interesting tales. So I am trying to look at that particular time from a little girl's point of view.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. So, tell me a little bit more about that. So, I hesitate to try and say that Shankara.
You can call him Shankara, Adiguru.
Shankara.
Yes, that works because that's how Sharadi will address him throughout the story.
Okay, Shankara. Okay, so what? Let's see. How I want to go about this. Let's see. So, what I'm curious about: are you trying to tell a story about Sharadi, the girl? Or are you trying to tell a story about Shankara?
No, the focus of the story will always be Sharadi.
Right, but I don't mean right. I don't mean quite just focus, because that can be a little bit ambiguous. I see that she's central to what's being said, but is the story about her and what happens with her throughout the duration of the story, or is she simply a vehicle to supply the story of the historical figure? That's
that's the main driving force. Like, she is witnessing everything, and somehow she connects with him. He comes and stays at her place, and she witnesses the historical movement of that particular huge door opening, which has never opened in the known human history. And then the Adi Guru's accession to the throne and everything. So that particular golden moment in the history of Hinduism, say, uh, has been told from her point of view, how she sees and how she interacts with him, or what she learns, what he in turn ends up learning from her, like that. So there's quite a bit of interaction between the two characters later in the story.
Mm-hmm.
So at one point of time, he actually ends up saying that your friends don't need a discourse on life from me when they have you. And she's like, no, please do humor me and talk to them once, like that. That also happens.
Mm-hmm.
So while she is a 7, 8 year old girl, and like the first paragraph, I wanted to show her like any other curious child playing with and water with friends and everything. But then her take on life is a bit different from the children her age. She's a bit more matured than them, and she has a different take on every situation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I want to bring about, and I'm stumbling on that point. It's not coming out the way I want it to. So I thought you would probably guide me to the right path.
Ah, thank you. It's a nice, I like that you suggested I will guide you as opposed to, come in like, yeah, okay. So I'll have you read some of the piece, but I feel like we're dancing around what I think is the issue here. I think that what you're writing is very engaging because you focus on the girl. So the girl does become the focus and the vehicle for me to have this experience, and you're handling that very well, I think. And I like that. But what I'm less sure of is feeling I had a mentor who talked about the story's lean, like as opposed to like someone staying still. It's like they're like this. And when you're like this and leaning, then you have to run along in order to stay upright, So like that sense of the drive of the story, I'm feeling a little bit less so, like how this story is about Sharadi and its drive, its protagonistic, the protagonistic drive, which is that lean, that I'm a little bit less clear about. And when we're unclear about that, what happens is that we essentially can write anything we want, and we're not always writing sentences or dialogue this is the way I think of it. They either advance the plot or they advance the characterization, and basically, or they do both. So, because it is the protagonist's story, they're the ones that they want something, they confront forces of adversity, and then they grow from that confrontation. And I'm not sure that I feel that. So then the experience of reading, it kind of wanders. It doesn't. So, but let's have you read a little bit. Let's see. I have that. I'll go to there. Maybe see this first page. Let's start from your break where she's playing with the other children and talk from there.
From Sharadi Aim?
Yeah, sure. Sharadi. Yeah, aimed and to my mark, that pink mark down at the bottom.
Sharadi aimed and filled a small blue pebble inside one of the squares drawn on the muddy ground. Her friends cheered and clapped as she went about hopping through the series of such tiny squares on one leg to retrieve her pebble from that square. She picked it up, and as she turned, the temple bell sounded throughout the village. Did you all hear the latest news? Shankaracharya has come to Kashmir, one of her friends, Jaya, said. Who? Sharadi asked as she hopped back to her starting place. Gosh, you are so ignorant, Sharadi, Lalita replied exasperated. You never know anything. Is there something worth knowing? Sharadi asked carelessly. We are hosting a very special guest this year, another friend, Kamla replied. Kirana scholar Shankaracharya. We always have guests and travelers coming to visit our temples. What is so special this time? Sharadi asked. He is different. There is a rumor amongst the villagers that he has come to open the south gate. Lalita replied in a chorus. South gate? Sharadi inquired distracted as she aimed for the next square. The temple gate, you stupid girl, the most challenging one for the scholars, which has never been opened before. Remember? Chaya said, exasperated. Oh, wow. So many travelers and scholars have tried it. Has anyone succeeded yet? Sharadi replied, bored.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back to this, but I'm going to start just with the opening. So in the opening, you have Sharadi walking along the banks of the river. The river is described as you write here. They were she moves the hair from her face. That's good. So that's all putting me really into the character. Although I'm not feeling the environment, I don't understand the area that she's walking in at all. This
I
is
actually described that area also. There was another paragraph before this, but then I felt for a short story like this in an anthology, maybe the main point is coming too late. So I kind of, cut it off.
Yeah, well, we are going to work in that way, but I'm just sort of, yeah, as a preamble, when we place the character into the scene, we do want to have a sense that the stage is set, that the setting exists, that they're in a place and location and time, and we want to find our ways to put some words at least that do that and ground the person there. She looks in the river and finds a pebble, and that really comprises the scene. The main thing I want to say is that Sharadi is alone in this. And so it does not seem to establish the conflict, the tension of the piece. And this might be combined with the fact that maybe that doesn't exist exactly in the piece yet. So, I mean, these things maybe work together, but my hope for a beginning is that we really, in a short piece, we don't have time. We want to get the players on the page. So that's Sharadi, and then whatever it is that is the antagonistic force that is going to be challenging her and stopping her from getting what she wants. That becomes the conflict of the piece. It can be that the entire piece doesn't really have that. So I'm talking about something that doesn't exist in the piece yet, but that I would encourage you to think about, because it's the conflict, as suggested in the opening, that basically drives the reader on to make them wonder what's going to happen. Here, it seems that what you're spending some time basically putting some weight on this pebble that she's going to use. And so that might be symbolic, right? And it may have some kind of usefulness, but symbols, it's maybe a little complicated, but symbols are static. They're not dynamic. And we want to establish the dynamics of the story early on, because it's sort of like it's like the weather vane or something, I want to have a metaphor for it, but it tells us what direction the story is going in. And the story itself is an active, dynamic thing. It's a dynamic span of time that the reader gets to experience, and they get to experience the dynamics of the story through reading it. And that's what we want to basically offer on the page right away, so that the reader knows that they're going to have that dynamic experience. Because the fear for the reader is that they're going to have instead a static experience. And by static, I mean not moving. So the opposite of dynamic, static and dynamic. The static experience is, I believe, not what the reader is looking for. That doesn't mean that we in our lives have not been forced to read works that are static, or that we might feel that we should be justified in writing a static piece that others might be forced to read later. I'm not going to make arguments about that, but it's not the ideal situation, because the reader really wants to experience a dynamic and even difficult circumstance. And as I've said many times, they want to experience that, but in the comfort of their home, sitting in their chair, simply reading about it. So they get to have excitement. They get to have the excitement of the story while not having the peril of the story, right? That's the ideal circumstance for the reader. I was just going to say, so like, this is really, this is boilerplate for me. When I read this first paragraph, I'm really not evaluating the writing. The writing is fine, it's wonderful, but it lacks this dynamic quality. And so you see that I write in the side, I say, character alone. There's no dynamics possible with a character who's alone, unless the environment is somehow challenging them. The character walking through a storm, maybe that is meaningful. It's not ideal, but at least it's a dynamic. But if they're just simply alone without any problems, it isn't going to be dynamic. So I just offer that up. I would probably start when the action starts. That's what I would aim at. The story
actually picks up momentum when Shankaracharya enters the film. But the thing is, my challenge is to bring about 9th century Kashmir. People should be able to feel what kind of atmosphere it was that time. I cannot do that. And I cannot establish Sharadi's character once that person comes into the picture. So I understand that the story is getting a really slow start here. I'm not able to balance the two things. Because one of the comments that I got for the story was that the writing changes when he comes into the picture.
Well, I think that you're beginning here with the children and playing the game is a good one. So anyway, I've made my comment about the river. So the river is, I've commented. Okay, so you can make your decisions about that.
Okay.
When Sharadi aimed and threw the small pebble inside the squares drawn on the muddy ground, to me, that's much more dynamic, right? Her friends cheered and clapped as she went about. Or maybe they didn't, they scoffed. They're like, you're gonna fall, you're doing, whatever they're doing, but she's with her friends. And so now to me, that is much more dynamic. There's multiple people there. So I have a sense of forces, because whenever there are multiple people, we do have dynamic forces, no matter how simpatico, so no matter how sympathetic we might feel towards the other people who are around us, there are dynamics. I think it simply is the case. There are different characters who want to get what they want from their point of view, and they are not the same. So there's a dynamic available. So I think that that's nice. I think that she picked it up, and as she turned, the temple bell sounded throughout the village. Gives me a sense of the time, gives me a sense of the way things are communicated here. This is not social media. We didn't get a ping on our phone. We have a temple bell instead. So I would love to have more sensory information in this opening so that I can understand it. We do, in order to create point of view, we use sensory information. So that's sight. We want to use the sight of our central character, what they see. We want to use hearing, what they hear, which is multi-directional, right? They hear the bell even though they don't see it. We want to have what they smell is probably the next sensory experience, what they touch, and then the most intimate of the sensory experience is what they taste. So we want to use all of those in order to create that sense of that when we read sensory experiences, the reader feels that they are the person, and that's a very, very powerful tool. And we don't want to lose it. What we do is we touch down upon it from time to time to remind the reader. And you do that fairly well here. Even you have this dialogue between Sharadi and the other children, and you come back to Sharadi from time to time. But when we write a lot of dialogue, it can become a little diffuse. We don't necessarily know that we're in the character of Sharadi anymore because we're getting all this objective information. When we have dialogue, basically, for the reader, that's the sensory information of hearing. But hearing is not really felt and associated with the body. So you have to make sure you keep the connection of Sharadi hears them, right? Sharadi looks over to her friend who's laughing at her mistake, right? Make sure that you keep grounding the reader in the character. What is developed in this dialogue is simply that this Shankaracharya, trying. Okay, Shankara is coming, but the scene itself still basically feels static. I don't feel like there's a drive of character. I don't feel like this is Sharadi's story, that she's trying to get something, that she's driven to something, and that something is, like, even if it was something like, so Sharadi might say, I'm going to go see him. It's like, you can't go see him. You're not worthy to go and witness this event. I'm just making something up off the top of my head, but I want to create dynamics of protagonism and antagonism. I can go see him. I can see him just like anyone can. No, only the most noble people can see him. Only the top scholars can talk to him. It's like, I'm a top scholar. You are not a top scholar, right? So it's something that creates a dynamic that she then overcomes, because the story, I say this to my daughters quite a lot, and they're definitely annoyed by it. But the story is not simply about what a character wants. It's about what they're willing to do to get it. So we both want to understand what the character wants and what's driving them, and then we want to demonstrate what they're willing to do to get it. In this scene now, what I'm getting again is a little bit static. So, where am I looking at? Okay, so maybe people will take my word for it that, you haven't read the entire scene, but in the entire scene, I don't feel us moving on. I feel us sort of staying in the same territory, which means that we're writing, we would say that we're not being economical. Being economical means we're either advancing the character, basically showing a greater depth of the character, or we're advancing the plot. And actually, those two things can happen simultaneously, right? So it would be advancing the plot and showing us character. If Sharadi said, I'm going to go see him, her friends say, you can't, you're no scholar. And she's like, I am a scholar, right? So that's advancing the plot and the character. We're understanding the character a little more. We understand that she's going to try and go there. They say, oh yeah, why are you a scholar? What have you ever read? Do you even know how to read? She's like, I'm learning, right? So that's advancing the story. Just going back and forth saying you're stupid, right, is static. That's just simply there. We don't see her confronting that. And then you do use a word that I will never, ever use in my writing. You say, oh, that. So many travelers and scholars have tried it. Has anyone succeeded yet? Charity replied, bored. I never use the word bored because I don't want that idea ever to come into my reader's mind. Boredom is the thing that is like the great that's the great antagonist for us writers. Having the reader, and I know that all of us have read many things that have bored us, and we've been forced and flogged. We've had some school marmish instructor, saying with a switch, saying you must read it, stay awake. We can't depend on that. We never want our reader to be bored, and that's why we always want to have dynamic action and not static action. So, and while that's an aspiration that maybe I try to succeed at, I would never want to cue my reader's subconscious brain by using the word bored, because I don't want them to go, gosh, I am bored, and then put my book away and then go do everything else they want to do. So anyway, that's my big talk, but it comes back to the thing we were talking about at first, that it's my feeling that you can't simply use Charity as a vehicle to see and witness this other history that doesn't really involve her, basically using her like a camera, right? She becomes a camera, a point of view camera for you to depict this other story. I don't think that is what you can do, because the camera is a static thing. She has to be a dynamic, involved individual in the story, and it actually has to be about her and how she is, I'm going to back up for a second. A story is about a character with a problem. So there's something amiss. It's what John Barth calls the unstable ground situation. So they come in with some problem. Charity has some issue. She's not perfect. None of our protagonists cannot be perfect. They actually have a flaw. They have a problem. They have an instability. They want something that is not going to give them what they need, basically. And this is what we see played out. And through the circumstance of the story, the protagonist gains something at the end. So for that to happen, you have to think about Charity and what is her difficulty. Her difficulty is not an external difficulty of, let's say, her friends saying that she's stupid. Her difficulty is an internal difficulty.
There is an angle like that.
Okay. So these are the things that you want the story of Charity and her struggle. That's the core of the story. And around that, we should see the history. So then it becomes this unique point of view in which we experience that history. And we see it from this unique angle, basically. The larger universal angle, I think you already know. And I think your readership already knows the larger universal history. That's seeing it sort of from they know it from an omniscient point of view. So in this case, what you're doing is you're showing that same history from a very subjective, personal point of view. And that story is dynamic and engaging. The reader wants to read it. And so they read that story about Charity because they identify with Charity. But for you and your purposes, added to that is they get this history as a backdrop to it. I think you have a really great start. And actually, you will find that if you work on the dynamics of the character, right, and start creating that force of protagonism that's trying to move forward and antagonism that's trying to stop her from moving forward, the piece becomes much more exciting. I mean, the dialogue of Charity saying, "I'm going to go," and her friend saying, "You can't go," is already elevated quite a large degree, to my mind. So that's my little comment of the day.
You actually pointed me in the right direction. Thank you so much. I mean, these 2-3 points are really great, and I'll work on it. Submit it again.
You've conceived of your character. You've conceived of your character, and she's fantastic. And you've really gone into this place, and you're writing it very well. So now it's just a matter of overlaying this other aspect of it, which you'll find if you do it well, and you have to make it really basic, make it simple, because stories are actually very simple. They're about protagonists and antagonists in conflict. When you do that, you'll see that a lot of things can fall away, but also a lot of other things will present themselves.
Thank you so much. I wanted to rework on this piece, but I had no idea how to go about it. Now I have a fair idea, so I'll work on it.
The thing that I've always found most difficult is once we have something written that's complete, is that it's hard to really take our scalpel to it, thoroughly.
I have already worked on it 2 or 3 times earlier. And
right, I know.
now it was a stagnation. Like, I don't know what else to do with it.
Yeah. So one thing that I do is a little trick.
Perspective, yes.
Right. I've had a lot of people, tell me that I become sort of manifest as like a little parrot that's on their shoulder that's like barking at them, or a little demon or something, it's like, stick to the story. What's the story? Keep it, what's the conflict? Da 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 da. So you can write at the top just an experiment. And when you're in the experiment mode, just cut, cut. Not advancing the story, it's gone. Keep the core and just drive the story sentence by sentence. And you'll be surprised.
In order to establish her character, I went on writing many things that were actually not needed for the story.
Yeah, that's right. That's what we do. We develop the character, but you know what? It's so funny when we're developing a character, we're thinking of them statically, right? Because we're imagining this static character. So it makes sense that we end up getting on the page a static character. But then we got to take that character, we got to take all that development work, put it here, and now let's write the driving story. We know the character. You know this character. So, yeah. So it's a great start.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Madhavi. Ram, what are you doing? Long time. What have you been up to?
Yes, a long time. I have been a little busy with work, so my writing had taken a little bit of a backseat. But I have started writing again, so hopefully I should be able to submit something in the next week.
Ram, you look like you've become younger. Tell me about that.
I shaved off my mustache for a change.
You look like you look like, I mean, before I was like, oh yeah, Ram and I we're contemporaries. I'm sure that's not true, but I'm like, we're contemporaries. You know, we banty these ideas back and forth. But now I feel like you're in your 20s.
Thank you for that compliment. Yeah.
You had a question?
Yes. So I think you said something extremely important just now, and that really struck a chord with me. You said that we cannot have a static character as a camera through which we see or narrate an event. So I have always wondered at, like, a lot of historical novels, what they do is they don't, some of them obviously is through the protagonist or the antagonist, but a lot of them narrate the story through some other character. But when you said this, I realized that in all of them, the character through which the story is narrated is an active participant in the story. In every case, they're an active participant. So a small example came to my mind, if I may, with your permission. So essentially what you're saying is that we want to hear about a match not from a spectator in the stands, not from a commentator sitting in a glass box. We want to hear about what happened in the match from a player who was standing on the field.
Right. They're even if they're in the outfield, right. We're involved in the story of them in the outfield, and we see the entire match. So they might be like, maybe there's a fly that's bothering them, and they're like trying to concentrate, but the fly, right? That's actually the story that we're interested in. Correct. And then in the meantime, there's, the crack. I mean, I'll go to baseball, the crack of a bat, the crowd, and the person looks away, they've missed it. They haven't even seen it, right? And it's not that the ball is necessarily even going to come to them, but it's going to be about them then going home, and then they're sitting with their family, and they're like, it must have been amazing that you were there. You saw the most marvelous thing that's ever happened in the universe. And they say, yes, it really was. Well, tell us a little bit about how it changed you. And it's like, it made me understand how insignificant some things really are. Right. And then you're like, oh, that's true. Like one of the I mean, it's a little bit complicated example, but The Great Gatsby, what's considered by many to be the greatest American novel. So The Great Gatsby is told from the point of view of Nick. Yeah. It seems to be the story of Gatsby. Everything is about Gatsby. Correct. But it is not about Gatsby. It is about Nick and how he is changed by Gatsby. True. That's true. He acts as a narrator. He's in the story. He does things in the story. He hears things. He talks to people. He's wowed by Gatsby. Gatsby talks to him. Gatsby is killed. No spoiler alert. And at the end, Nick is the one transformed. It's actually not Gatsby's story, even though the title is The Great Gatsby. It is about Nick's story. Yeah. To be very honest, I read Great Gatsby and I was extremely bored by it. I thought it was like a whine and a complaint kind of a thing. I just couldn't relate to it. I plodded through it simply because it's supposed to be a great novel, but I just couldn't relate to it. Because you had to. Yeah, I know. I think I probably got in. I mean, most of the books that I've really gotten into, particularly later, those classics, is because I was a writer and I was reading it to learn about writing. So that was my, if you say that this is a masterpiece, well, I want to know how you write a masterpiece. So I'm going to try and learn everything. I was motivated. I wasn't being told. Yes, when I was young and told that I had to read it and that it was amazing and that my world would be changed by it and that it was all about America, I was like, are you kidding me? This is no, I'm also sure that a lot of cultural references are alien to me in that. So that could also be another reason why I didn't get it. Well, it's probably a little bit more because the nature of the conflict for Nick is cerebral, right? it's a question of disposition, and you can see that even if you read the beginning. I don't want to get too drawn into The Great Gatsby, but to have a more acute struggle, like even the story that I made up about the outfielder with the fly bothering them, that's a much more acute struggle that we can identify with.
True.
Right? You know, in this moment of great historical context, this person is basically they're being kept from it. They're being kept from history by this fly.
Yeah, true. Thank you very much for that. It was very insightful. Thank you. Great.
Nice to see the new you, and to see you again. I understand you're the same person.
Thank you.
Ashvani, let's talk about your piece, and then Sri Charan, then we'll talk about yours. Let's see, where are you here? Ashvani, tell me a little bit what's going on here.
This is a book I got as almost sort of an advanced copy to do a review. And I took it on as an exercise to see whether my review meets your approval in terms of what you taught us about how to write a review. So this was an exercise to see whether it meets your approval or
not. Okay. Great. Well, I'm not sure. So, because, you know, you know, the story of the fish and the fishbowl that just goes around, and every time it's like it sees a little castle and it's always new. That's how I am. So I'm not sure what I've said about reviews in the past that you're applying here. So we're going to have to talk about it as if it's a fresh work, and we'll go from there. So I think for me, I would want to, you know, with a review, I would want to make sure that I contextualize it for the reader. You know, in case a reader, you want to think of your reader as not necessarily knowing what context you're putting it in. Maybe they find the review, maybe there's an open book somewhere and they pick it up. It's not part of a website, it's not part of a magazine. We don't know. We want to do the work of contextualizing the thing that we're writing. So you do want to get that information up front. I think you begin here with a quote. I think a quote could be useful, but I would do some of that little work first. So, because like for me, and think of someone who completely does not understand the context. Begum Hazrat Mahal?
That's right, Begum Hazrat Mahal.
Okay, I like the way you say it better. That's a person, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, as funny as it might seem, I don't know that when I read those words, because I don't know this person at all, and I don't understand. So I'm distanced by language, so I already don't know that. I don't know if that's the title of the book, right? I don't know who the author of the book is. So these are some important things that you want to get onto the page.
Okay.
You might want to, we often want to say something about the author in a review. Is it their first book? Are they a, you know, a seasoned author? Are they someone that we've all heard of? Because in a review, we are sort of saying, we're sort of talking to a potential readership and saying that you either do or don't want to read this book by this author, right? So we're really talking about that specific thing, and we want to get that information onto the page right away. Then I think it's a good idea to introduce the general character of the book, you know, so that it's historical fiction, dealing with this period. And what you write about the history is very good. So clearly you know that history. Is that true, or did you have to look it up?
No, this is part of history. And yeah, I think So that part is not fiction. The fiction part is where those additional peripheral characters are introduced, and their emotions and their feelings, their interiority is expressed. That's where the fiction comes.
And actually, the conversation we're having with Madhavi and we just continued with Ram, it actually applies to this book, it seems. There's historical events, but you're adopting point of view characters, maybe several of them, it seems, I'm not positive. And we see their stories with a backdrop of these historical events that everyone knows about. So in regard to the history, I think it can be good too to understand that it's a history that you know well, but maybe some other people don't. Like, you can always use me as an example. You know, does that know nothing Otis know anything about this topic? And the answer is always going to be no, he knows nothing. And think of me as one of you, as your readership. And go ahead, and readers who do know about it are never bothered by having it confirmed that they are, you know, erudite and intelligent and world readers. They never tire of that message. And those of us who aren't, we are happily informed. So try and imagine that readership that doesn't know quite as much as you might know, if you can, Ashwani.
Okay.
I think that I would probably look at this in terms of formatting as I would say something about, I would present the book, I would probably present the author, I would present the major subject of the book, and that it's historical fiction, and say something about that. So let's see. So we have a paragraph that's establishing the book. We have a paragraph that's talking about it as historical fiction with fictionalized characters that employs maybe fictionalized characters and characters that are, you know, part of the historical record. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah. Begum Hazrat Mahal is the one character, and of course Jailal, her, you know, sort of commander-in-chief. These two are definite characters, and the others, you know, the British officer, the Indian maidservant, they're all made up.
Right. So I would probably make my next paragraph be about the historical fiction, you know, the stories that we're involved in. Probably. I'm not, you have to take a look, but think of everything in terms of paragraphs, like dealing with things in terms of paragraphs. You basically talk about the historical fiction elements at the end, and I would probably try and bring that up top. You know, you've already established that it's historical fiction, that this is a true history, and I would say something briefly about that. Then I would bring up the historical fiction. Basically, what is the driving story? Are there multiple stories? Do we see this historical backdrop through various perspectives, et cetera, et cetera? So then I would present that. Then I would try and present the history. And when you present the history, I would probably try to present it at a slightly higher level than, let's say, most people simply understand it. Does that make sense? So like, be a little, you know, do some work for the reader. You don't want to simply, you do want to remind them of the history, but go a little bit deeper, as if you're a little bit like a deeper authority. You know, we understand that we're probably just going to Wikipedia in order to get the information. That's okay. You're not going to archival information, but you want to have the suggestion that you really know this history. So then what you've done is you've presented historical fiction, the basic premise. You've presented a kind of in-depth piece about the history. And now in your last paragraph, you want to bring the two together. How does this combination of fiction, the historical and the fiction, how does it come together to create its effect? Because that's really the big question. So, I mean, when someone is writing history, they're basically taking on two chores, right? And they're synthesizing two different things. They're synthesizing their ability to write fiction, right, which is tell a great yarn, and their ability to depict history accurately or not accurately. So they're taking on those two things. So paragraph 1, fiction. Paragraph 2, the actual history. Paragraph 3, this is actually 4 because we have an introduction, sorry. The 5th paragraph is how well do they do synthesizing these two things? And will this be an enjoyable read for the fiction reader and the history reader? Or will both the history and the fiction reader, will they get something but also lose something?
Understood.
Right? Because, I mean, as we think of it, we know, jack of all trades, master of none. This is a case where a writer is taking on both the ability to handle history and the ability to handle fiction. Do they do that well so that it rises above what you might get with fiction or what you might get with history, or does it fall below what you would get with either?
Understood.
Then, if it were me, Ashvani, and because I'm always curious about your personal experiences, because I trust you as an author, right? You want to do that too with your reviews. You want to build the point where you have some kind of ethos. You make recommendations. You want someone to say, I love Ashvani's reviews. He's never steered me wrong. That's what you want. Okay. And for that, I would suggest, and also because I would like to see it, is that you just write something that's a little bit more personal. Maybe at the end, about your experience in reading. Like, for example, you might write something like, I, as a person who knew this history well, found myself deeply engaged. I was more concerned with what was going to happen to the character as she brought the cold soup to the commander than I was about the revolution that I knew was imminent. I was completely captured and enthralled by these characters who were richly drawn and real. Wow, that was beautiful. I would write that paragraph and I think you're all set. No, but something personal where you think about your experience with it, or maybe your experience wasn't that. You were like, for me, I couldn't give up, my knowledge of the actual historical experience and step into. I wasn't able to have a willing suspension of disbelief with these fictionalized characters. The true history intruded upon it, and my expectations for an accurate adaptation of that history, whatever, or details were missed, whatever it is that you want to say. For better or worse, right? That personal aspect of the review is important because you want people to, in a sense, follow your advice. Like, you might have it that someone reads that review and they says, well, Ashvani was completely wrong about that. You want to take a stand somewhere so that people know, yay or nay, I appreciate this review, or it's hopeless. That was no help to me whatsoever. You want people to be able to decide. And for that, you have to get yourself on the page. I mean, even if it's like Ashvani, all he does is, criticize amazing books. Let's see what he's up to today. Like, even if you're a critic that's never satisfied, that's holding the bar too high, that's also something that you want to present. Whatever it is, present yourself, present you. And I mean, I think your presentation is of a person who's remarkably knowledgeable, but also a very sensitive reader and a sensitive writer. Because you're a sensitive writer, you're also a sensitive reader. And I think that's what you would try to get to in terms of the personal presentation. But I would like to see that too.
Got it.
But yeah, I think that this is a great start. I'm excited to read your review. I probably will not read the book, but it's also true that a lot of people they read reviews of books, so it can seem as if they've read the book. So you want to present enough that gives people information so that they can parrot your point of view, you having read the book, and then they can parrot your point of view when they talk at a cocktail party about the book. That's good. Yeah, any questions?
Otis,
no, I got it.
Yeah.
Sunil here.
Hi, Sunil.
Sunil.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine. I just had a few questions on your comments on the book review. Now, what if a book review promotes a certain ideology, which is either to the leftist side of the intellectual spectrum, or say like Ashwini ji has written a review of Begum Hazrat Mahal. Now, I wrote a Quora answer on this lady many years back. So it was upvoted by many Indians and Pakistanis, since the lady was an Indian nationalist and belonging to a particular faith, which they identified with. So now, even in India or say the West, you have certain publications which are generally regarded as, say, Guardian in the UK would be regarded as leftist. So the same book review, if it is by some publication, I'm just giving a rough example here, say Fox News was to review this, or the Guardian were to review this particular book, they would come out with diametrically opposite sounding reviews. So in that case, what is a reviewer expected to be as an objective? Because no individual as such is detached from the society he's living in.
Okay. You're asking. So you're saying right here. So Begum Hazrat Mahal is sort of a politicized figure, and so within the context of Indian.
I'm not saying she's a politicized figure, but considering the amount of people we have in the world, they will come up with their own perceptions. This was just a general question.
Right,
I'm just
extrapolating
from this.
Right, I do understand that, but right. So I guess what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to, let's say, use this book as an example, rather than talk in a very general way, because I mean, I can talk in a general way too, as we know. But maybe I'll start with talking with a general way. So like if we're thinking about a review as basically promoting some kind of another agenda, let's say that. So like when you're talking about newspapers that have an agenda, like Fox News or in the US, let's have the Village Voice, that are on the spectrum of left and right. Maybe we'll think of that as a hidden agenda, right? The newspaper it's not overtly, yes, we understand finally that it's rather overt, but they don't overtly declare themselves as being, Fox News doesn't overtly declare themselves as being on the right. And the Guardian doesn't overtly declare itself as being on the left. I'm just making up words, so I'm not trying to delineate anything here. But so they have an ulterior motive basically in terms of advancing a certain ideology. Then I think what you have is you have reviews that are biased, basically. You don't have reviews that are objective. And so as a reviewer, I think you want to determine for yourself whether you want to have an unbiased review, which will be in the center, or whether you want to have a biased review, which would be on either side, which means that you're reviewing for the purpose of advancing some kind of political or ideological, or belief system, whatever it is, right? You wish to advance that. Adopting that means that as a writer, it seems to me, you are involving yourself in a larger struggle, and you are basically a participant in that larger struggle, a kind of warrior for your ideology. And I think that that's a choice. Or you could choose to be a writer who is, in the Platonic ideal is, I think we would even think that Plato is a little bit suspect of this, is trying to be objective. And let's say this, that finding true objectivity is probably something that can never be achieved, right? Sunil, might you agree?
Yeah, I agree.
Right. So true objectivity can't be achieved, but are we trying to, or are we simply, trying to throw ourselves into the influencers that fall on both sides, right? Like, we're advancing something no matter what. So we're always advancing something, but are we simply going to try and influence, and then as we go further, manipulate, and maybe as we go further to the outside of that, coerce people to believe what we believe? So we come back to here, maybe we're driven to be in the center. When we're driven to be in the center, then and try to be as objective as we can be, with an understanding that, of course, we have our internal biases. And as writers, I think we always want to examine those if we're striving to write in the center, and not simply defend our biases if we're on the sides. But we want to present something that's very measured. So with Ashvani's piece here, let's say, I don't know anything. If this character is politicized in any way, I don't know about it, right? So I'm giving Ashvani advice that's based on really being in this center place. And what I'm suggesting he write about is, in a sense, this sort of artistic merit of this work only, right? Not whether it should be advanced. I'm not seeing it as being advanced or not advanced in some political sphere, but actually whether it should be advanced in this, let's say, idealized realm of art. And let's again agree that that idealized realm of art is politicized, and I'm just making a distinction for my own purposes, but that that he simply evaluated based on its artistic merit. Its artistic merit, it seems to me, in this case, is going to be derived in the way that it effectively combines history and fiction. If Ashvani is trying to review this piece with a sense of that objectivity, but the subject matter is politicized, he might address that in the piece, right? He might address that the character Begum Hazrat Mahal has been taken on as a champion of the nationalists, or whatever you want to say, has been taken on by has been held up as a champion of nationalist rights. This may or may not be the case, Ashvani might write, but the depiction here is of a woman with uncommon valor and bravery. What comes across is not her is not an ideological disposition, but a passionate, the passionate disposition of a woman who loves her people and her family, right? So I might say something like that. Or if I wanted to be biased, I would say I would lean on the nationalism of it, right? I would say, you know, she's a hero to people who also will da 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 da. The fact that she is this symbolic hero, someone that we hold in such highest self-esteem, however, does not diminish from the artistic merits of this book and should be read by everyone from both sides of the spectrum. Say something like that. So we have a lot of choices. I think, Sunil, what gets to the heart of your question is what does the author want to do? I liked how that sounds sort of ominous and trailed off.
Yeah. But unless I know something about the author, it is kind of difficult to gauge the author's intentions, except I may get a certain feeling reading a particular author. Say, if I read Christopher Hitchens, I know that he's against every religion. To give you, say, a Western example, so even though I've never met Christopher Hitchens, he's already, I think he's already passed away. So, but, and I've seen a few of his videos, so I can...
Well, sorry, Sunil, let me break in. When I said author, I actually meant the author of the review. So,
okay.
I mean...
Author of the review. Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
I got that wrong.
What does the author of the review want to do in terms of how they're looking at the work? You know, and this again, so like if you have an author, so the author of the book, you're the reviewer, so I'm really talking about you. But if you're reading the book and you see that the author of the book has a bias, or they do have a bias, I personally, so I think bias, you know, presenting bias means we're engaged in a kind of propaganda, right? And I mean that not pejoratively, but of course it has a pejorative feel to it, but propaganda means you're propagating ideas. So, and usually when you're propagating ideas, you're propagating them without specifically saying that you're propagating them.
Right.
This is also something that I would think about myself. If I were propagating political ideas for myself, I would admit that I was doing that. I try, though I'm a writer, and clearly my overall business is to manipulate the emotions of my readership and primarily make them turn the page of my own work. That's really what I'm trying to do in my vast, you know, machinations. But I would probably want to admit that I was doing that. If I saw that there was an author that was surreptitiously advancing a propagandistic point of view, I would probably address that. But if I was a propagandist myself for that point of view, then I wouldn't do that, right? And it's complicated. So again, it comes down to what is it that I want to do? Do I want to acknowledge that? Do I want to see that I'm getting something that is propagandistic and advancing a point of view and point that out? Or do I want to simply advance that propagandistic point of view and simply roll it over to the next person, right? But as a writer myself, I would say, and this is probably true of all of us as writers, this is the place where we live, right? I mean, all we talk about is how language can achieve an effect with our audience, right? This is all that we're talking about. And so we are experts at this. And again, it comes down to then what do we want our contribution to be? What do we want to do? When we write our review, what do we want that to represent? Everything that we write is a reflection of our aspirations. And so we have to make some decisions about what we want those to be. So Neil, this is a very complicated thing. I love talking with you about this stuff because I know that you think about it very deeply, and I really appreciate that.
Thanks for the insights, Otis. That helped me. Ashwini ji, just a small comment. Your review is pretty good. I think there's a typo in as in before Mirza Wajid Ali. It should be 1856, probably.
Yes. Right. I just realized that.
I also noticed that, Ashwani, but I didn't want to mention it because I don't want. No, I'm kidding. I did not notice.
I'm just about 100 years ahead of time.
Yeah, thanks, Otis.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
And thank you for this, Ashwani. Okay, let's look at Sri Charan's piece. Sri Charan, are you still here? I don't see you.
Yeah, Otis, I'm here.
There you are. You're speaking. Brings you to the top of my list. Okay, tell us a little bit about this piece.
Yeah, so this piece is about a man who just want to become a filmmaker, but unfortunately gets entangled in a series of events. The motivation for writing this piece came from directly my experiences actually after binge watching a few horror movies. So a few haunting experiences. I mean, these are all mind tricks, but these can become scary sometimes. So I wrote this with a view of washing myself of all that experience.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. Let's see. Let's have you, if you can see this section that I have here, so people can get a sense. Just read this little section that's on the page, so we can get a little sense of the mood of this piece.
Yeah, sure. Added to the shadows, this distinct knocking made me mad, as I failed to identify the source of this sound. I feared that my mind was failing, and I was about to be pushed off that cliff I was standing on, when I finally recognized the source of the knocking after 2 weeks. I happened to lean out of the window in my room one day for fresh air, and I saw the pigeons nestled on the AC outside. I saw one pigeon poking with its beak when the distinct knock came straight from the AC inside. This knocking snapped me at that moment, as I leaned dangerously out the window to grab that pigeon by the neck and popped its head off its body. When I was back to my senses, I was horrified with myself. That night, I waited for the knocking sound, but it did not come. I slipped into sleep somehow, and could not remember how long I had been asleep when I heard the sound of the wings flapping. My eyes opened to the sight of a pigeon standing atop me on my chest. It did not move, nor tried to peck me with its sharp beak. It stayed still, as if carrying a message from God that I was beyond redemption, and that the devil had claimed me for himself. At that moment, I heard a rotten laugh, but from whom I could not tell. It might as well be mine or the devil's.
Okay, so there's a lot about this piece that I really like, and I think so. For those of you who haven't read it, it will be difficult to get a sense of how good some of this is. And I think it's good because Shrutran, I did get a sense that you knew of what you were writing. Because you're sort of, and you have this, I don't know if it's something to be admired, okay, honestly, but it is something that I feel I also have, this ability to turn the lamp inward, right? And to put words to these nuances of emotion that sort of dictate actions this way or that, you know, and not for the purpose of aggrandizing yourself, but also not for the purpose of deprecating yourself, but for the purpose of trying to basically understand that internal psychology. Like, what made this happen? What made that happen? What was going on? So that the psychological aspect that you're probing here in what on the page is a character, I feel how that's a probing of yourself, and that you're then revealing it on the page. I mean, it's what you've done in a lot of other works too, works that you have no knowledge of. It's really fully imagined from my point of view. Like, I admire it. It's not an objectification, right? It's not the lamp shining on this object and you're writing about it. It is the lamp shining inward. It's a little bit, I don't know if you've ever, have you ever taken a look or investigated John Keats? He has this idea of negative capability.
No.
It's a little bit of this ability to create a vacuum, you know, for the writer to create a vacuum in which they allow information both about themselves but about the world to come in. That's how I see it a little bit, and I feel like you have that.
Oh.
So now let's address what you don't have.
Yes.
That's a joke. When the lamp is just facing this way, we lose everything else. So we have this consciousness, you know, in this letter form, and it's a deeply internalized consciousness and a deep reflection of the self. And you mark the line, basically it's kind of like this. So I sort of identify, and it's just me, so who knows, there are probably many others, but basically two narrative forms. One is what we call the hero's journey, that involves a protagonist and an antagonist, in which the protagonist has an arc of character, they go to a low point, they make a decision, and they transcend, or they go down with the ship. And if they go down with the ship, that's also a kind of transcendence, a kind of stubborn transcendence in the human spirit. Either way, it says something about the human spirit. That's one type of story. The other type of story I call a metamorphosis story. And it's probably best depicted by the story whose name it's derived is The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, in which Gregor starts off as a cockroach and he ends up as a dead cockroach. Do you know that story?
No.
Okay, so that's a metamorphosis. He does not change. He's not engaged in a dynamic struggle so much as he simply is overwhelmed by circumstances coming at him, and then he dies. So it's just a straight downward trajectory. It's not an arc. So we can see that this is a beautiful and maybe even a hopeful story. The metamorphosis story has no hope about it. This story is like that. He starts out, basically, he starts out damned, right? You know, he's writing this letter saying that the noose is waiting for me in the other room, and he ends up basically, we believe, using that noose. It's simply a downward trajectory.
Yeah, I struggled with this. I thought to remove the first paragraph and probably put it as suspense at the last, but I thought it was cheating the reader or whoever was writing the letter, kind of thing.
Well, the issue is that the issue of these two types of stories is not done with any kind of sense of surprise. That would have just been a gimmick. It actually has to do with the forces of protagonism and antagonism. So in the metamorphosis story, the protagonist is weaker than the antagonistic force. The antagonistic force is life itself. And basically, the protagonist enters the story beaten down by life. They already are at a kind of low level. And the forces of life simply win. The antagonist is huge, and the protagonist is very small. And the life overwhelms it. And it's an unequal struggle. Since Sunil was, and then, I talked about propaganda. Propaganda is sort of the opposite, okay? I mean, they're both kind of propaganda. This is propaganda of the hopelessness of humanity, so that's that propaganda. But there's an opposite propaganda of this person is a heroic figure, the protagonist is massive, and their adversary, life, or people with different ideas or whatever, they're tiny. They're that little point, that little dot. So the protagonist is, wonderful, right, correct, courageous, etc. And the antagonist is a straw man that simply gets overwhelmed. That's another kind of propaganda. So the propaganda of these ideas, these individuals are superior to everything else, or the propaganda of the person is small, hopeless, and weak, and life is going to crush them. The story that operates in the center of those two extremes is one in which the protagonist and the antagonist are equal forces. And this way, there's a dynamic struggle in which we don't know the outcome. In the propagandistic story, we know from the beginning that the hero wins. In the propagandistic story of the human being is small and meaningless, we know that life wins. Life, by meaning the world, the universe, whatever, it wins over the human being, or the protagonist wins over the straw man antagonist. We know the answer when we've begun. So there's nothing to discover in the story. The center story, and I'm not saying that the center story isn't its own kind of propaganda, it may very well be. But in the center story, there's a dynamic struggle that takes place, and the outcome is unknown. Kind of, but we'll just keep that to the side. So in this story, we actually have this poor guy, he ends up, there's COVID, there's all these horror films, there's the fear that, possesses his own body. He doesn't have a chance, and that's what gets realized at the end. So he never comes to the point of having a chance, having a choice, being able to do anything to control his own destiny. He's simply a
leaf in the wind.
A leaf in the wind, subject to fate. Exactly. The problem with it is that, like I say, there's not really a dynamic. So while I kind of enjoy the process that's taking place, if I don't ascribe to that propaganda, right? If I don't ascribe to that idea that the human being is powerless in the face of the world, then I'm a bit dissatisfied with what occurs. And I feel a little bit cheated that my character didn't have a chance. I don't know the answers for this at all. I mean, I know the answers that sort of that center story, the sort of the modern story, what it ends up doing is it basically takes these two forces and and this happens also intellectually when people do this in thesis-driven and nonfiction books too, they take the two forces that are equally matched and they basically merge them at the end. So it can seem as if it's ambiguous. There isn't one side that wins, the antagonistic side wins, or the protagonistic side wins. It isn't winning and losing. It's a more complex reality that gets revealed at the end. And we call this, James Joyce called it the epiphanic moment, you know, the sense of rising to a greater emotional and intellectual complexity. All that aside, Sritran, put that out of your mind. This story, I want you to finish, and I think that what it needs is it needs to have a more pronounced sense of that antagonistic force in terms of this environment. The antagonist in this piece is this character's isolation. It's their isolation, and then in that isolation, they only have one voice coming in, and that's the voice of horror cinema, right? So they're only getting one kind of information into this isolated experience. So their enemies are isolation to start with, that other things are not getting in. Once we understand that, we see that actually this character makes we can reconstruct this story to see that they actually make quite a choice at a certain point. What genre are they going to involve themselves in? When they make that choice, that's really the beginning of this story, right? Because they could have chosen romance, but they didn't. They could have chosen, you know, like list the various genres. I mean, I would love to see you do it, you know. And then why does this character gravitate towards horror, right? Why does he let that demon into his soul? He's a complex person, right? But he decides to be, in a sense, one-dimensional. That does not mean that the rest of him is gone, right? It means that he's made this choice, and now he's following this habituated choice down through the story. But this other part of himself is still there. That's the part of himself that we need to see reemerge at some point, I think, in this story. And I think also, I would like to know that it's very hard when we have that light shining inward, we lose the sense of the world. I don't see this world that he's isolated in. I don't see this apartment. I don't hear the sounds of the city outside that would again tell us about the isolation. I don't hear the shouts of a woman on the street saying, help me, and him saying, I could help her, but I'm going to sit here, you know, or her screams, you know, blended in with the screams of the latest, you know, murder victim in whatever horror film you were watching, right? I'm not getting the sense of that environment, that outside world, that antagonistic force, basically, with him. I only get a sense of his own consciousness. It's actually, you have the complete form of the story here. You have only one dimension of it. That's the issue. How you work in this other dimension, given that you're writing this as an epistolary, as a letter, that's the challenge, but you have to figure out how to do it. Because even though this might be the form of a letter, it's not the form of an epistolary, which is basically a story in letter form. You understand the distinction that I'm making? This sounds like a letter because it's one-dimensional like a letter would be. But that's not what you're writing. You're actually writing an epistolary, which is a story in letter form. So you have to handle the elements of the story, both sides, the protagonist and the antagonistic force, within the letter and figure out how to do so, even though that will make the letter not seem very letter-like. It's a compromise.
Yeah, so you're telling, I am writing a letter, but I'm still telling a story. So you have to have that element incorporated, like give that multidimensional aspect to what I am writing here.
Right. And so, and as I said to Madhavi in the beginning of this session, you know, have your character have all of the sensory experiences, because it's through sensory experiences, actually. Sensory experiences are the bridge between the individual and the world, right? I see it, I smell it, I taste it, I touch it. This is the bridge. Sensory experience is the bridge that reveals that outside world that's having an influence on us, that's embattled with us. The big person who's shouting at us, we hear them, we see that they're big, right? The sense of the walls, right, that are isolating him, the windows that are open, in which he can hear the sounds of the cars and the shriek of some child, or the pigeons that come to his window. All of those things, and the pigeons are an excellent example of that, but they're really the only one that you have here. And they're not really exactly real. We don't hear them coo, we don't smell them. They simply are, they seem somewhat symbolic, but they are that outside world.
Yeah, but I have one one question here. Like, so if you're telling we have to incorporate the outside world, right? But if we do that, don't we run into a risk of getting out of the mood of the story? Like, so the story is very moody kind of setting, right? But if I do that, we might lose that momentum. I'm telling.
What we have to do is, everything is understood in contrast. Because I'm only getting one kind of information, I'm not really perceiving, I don't perceive the isolation, right? So this is a little bit of a complicated argument I often make. I'm not always sure that it's gonna work. But I say, like, sometimes you have, I often get characters who are writing about emotional experience, right? And let's say, I teach a lot of people who write memoir and things like that. And what happens is, when we have difficult experiences, we sort of remove ourselves from them emotionally. We call that, psychologically, we call that disassociation. So we disassociate from ourselves. When I have someone, a memoirist, who's writing a story, they will often write a story as if there's no emotion there. And I comment, do not write a disassociative experience. Write a character who is disassociating, right? So let me see that it is an emotional experience that they are distancing themselves from. Don't write the experience as if there's no emotion there. The same thing applies to this. You're writing isolation. You need to be writing a character who is experiencing isolation. Right? So what you have on the page is just isolated. So then when I read it, it's too close. I'm simply isolated like that character is. I need to both be in the character and outside of the character. I need to be able to experience what the character is experiencing, but understand that they're experiencing something in a larger context. That's what makes me safe. Right? This is a little bit of a problem with the well-known book Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. It's completely within the subjective point of view of the main character. That main character goes through experiences and then finally commits suicide at the end of that story. The reader is too close to that experience in a lot of ways. I mean, it's heralded as a great book, and I understand that. And certainly in its time it was. But in terms of my way of looking at it, we don't want the reader to have, like, going back to my memoirist who's writing a disassociated experience, I don't want to read an experience without emotion. I want to read about a character who is struggling with life. And the way that they are struggling with the emotion of life is to disassociate from it. I want to have that experience. I want to have the experience here too of a character who is struggling with the isolation that has been created by the society around them, in a sense, that they have to, here they have COVID, but also they have to pigeonhole themselves into a specific genre in order to succeed, in order to, you know, they have to compartmentalize themselves. They have to become an expert, right? I mean, we know this about our culture. We have this expert culture where everyone is very narrowly focused on their expertise, and then therefore are isolated from everyone else. So that's also the case with your character here. They have to become an expert in horror, and they cannot be a generalist. They cannot succeed in that way against other people who are becoming experts. So they have to become that expert. And this is also isolating him. I don't know if all that makes sense, but you have to find a way to both, yes, continue to capture the mood of this character, which you have. So you don't have any problem there. You have it already written. But now you do need to add this other aspect of the world around them so that we can see this character in contrast, and we can see the forces of protagonism, this character struggling to, in a sense, survive in this world that is kind of dictating his own extinction. That's a lot of highfalutin words, but it just means you got to type. And I would type some more sentences that have sensory experiences in them that show him, you know, you cover this descending scale, but now think of those sensory experiences as also going down on a descending scale. He looks at the, a great movie that sort of depicts this is Barton Fink, if you've seen that.
Barton Fink.
Barton Fink. Yeah, it's by the something brothers. But take a look at that movie.
Oh, okay.
It's about a writer. Yeah, it's about a.
I just Googled it.
Yeah. Tell me the directors, since you see it there. Coen brothers.
Joel Coen and Ethan Coen.
Yeah, it's a Coen brothers movie. The Coen brothers are worth watching. They fall in line with what you're writing here.
Oh, okay. I'll definitely watch.
Yeah. Abhinav, I think that's it. Once again, a very intense.
It was.
Hour and 15 minutes.
Hour and 45 minutes. We started about 8:05. It's 9:45 p.m. So yeah, good. So, folks, just to give you a heads up, we're discussing some changes to this workshop format. I've been promising or threatening that I'll share details, but I will do that with Otis. I have to write them up. I'll share that new structure and format and how to take this forward. But in the meantime, do keep your pieces coming in, and I think these discussions do a lot for those who are interested and pay attention, and in just getting some things that may at some point in time stick at the back of our minds, and when we're writing, it comes tumbling out, and it helps improve our writing. So thank you all for sending your pieces. Thank you, Otis, for taking the time to review, edit, correct them, and send a feedback, and then for these Sunday discussions.
Yeah, and Abhinav, it could be too. I mean, we might want to meet every other week or something like that to give writers a little bit more time to, produce works and hand them in. I mean, that might be something you want to throw into the mix.
Yeah, let's do that. So today's the 13th of August, right? Maybe I'll cancel the one on the 20th and meet on the 27th instead.
Yeah, and then maybe we'll have a couple more works. I mean, we do have some writers who are producing and putting things in quite regularly, and it was great. We took this break, and it was so great. Ashwani sent me something when it was coming up, and it makes me feel like, you know, and, you know, got a couple other pieces, a couple other responses that, like, it makes me feel like, oh, people are excited to come and have this meeting and have these discussions, but they are intense. And then if we do it every week, maybe it becomes too routinized. You know, we should have a, you know, leave the audience wanting more, as they say.
Yeah, no, I agree. So,
okay, so let's do that. We'll do a 2-week stint this time, and then see how that goes.
Right. Okay, so we, as always, as before, we'll be putting this up on YouTube in a couple of days. I will share the link, and keep writing, folks, and have a good rest of Sunday.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Otis.
Bye.
Thank you, Abhinav.
Thank you, Otis.
Thank you, Otis.
Bye.
Thank you, Abhinav.
Yeah, thank you.